the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome Associated Disorders and its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now, I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the Program Coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to take a moment and draw your attention to the slide on your screen about our third annual Walk for TS on November 3rd in Mendham, New Jersey. For those of you in and around New Jersey, please join us on the 3rd. Form a team and walk or run with us. We also need volunteers to help with the lead up to the event as well as on the day of. If you can't join us that day, please log on to our website and make a donation in support of the services we offer, such as tonight's very timely webinar on Generation Text. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Michael Osit. Dr. Osit received his undergraduate degree in education and psychology from SUNY, the State University of New York, and his doctorate in counseling and psychology from Rutgers University. He is a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in Warren, New Jersey, where he does psychotherapy assessment for children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families. He also does school consultation and consults in a family physician medical residency program. He's also worked for many years as a school psychologist in New Jersey and Massachusetts. As a facilitator presenter, Dr. Osit has presented numerous workshops and lectures on a variety of topics related to children and families, including child-adolescent development, parenting skills, learning and behavioral disorders of children. Additionally, he's presented workshops on strategies for the classroom teacher, family and women's relationship issues, and promoting positive self-esteem in children and adults. He's published books and numerous articles on kids, families, and parenting. We were so intrigued by his latest book, Generation Text, Raising Well-Adjusted Kids in an Age of Instant Everything, we felt he would make a very interesting addition to our Wednesday webinar programming. Dr. Osit, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us, and without further introduction, I'm going to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, NJTCS, for allowing me to present tonight. What I think is a very, very interesting topic and something I'm very, very passionate about. I really want to just elaborate on my goals for tonight. Basically, what's happening is, the way I see it in terms of our youth growing up in the world today, that it's a very, very different world that they're growing up in compared to the one that you grew up in, whether you're a teacher or a parent listening or other professionals. So I really want you to understand that there's a subtle and overt influence on the psychological development of Generation Text child. I also want you to understand that you need to utilize unique dynamics and strategies needed to parent and work with Generation Text. So this workshop will really focus on providing professionals and parents with practical techniques and realistic strategies for navigating through this high-tech, fast-paced culture that's influencing our children. Your goal, of course, is to raise or work with happy, well-adjusted children. Just generally, sort of the process that we'll go through tonight. First, we're going to do some awareness. I want to raise your awareness of how the world really has changed. Now, some of what I'm going to present there is very, very obvious, but I really want you to think about it and think about it objectively. Just take a step out of your own world and just really think about the questions I ask and what I'm presenting in terms of how the world has changed, what has happened, why it's happened, and of course, most importantly, the latter half of the presentation will be what to do about it. Think about this. Do you remember a world without Facebook? How many of you remember a world without smartphones? How about a world just without cell phones? Does anybody remember the world without the internet? The world without computers? Do you remember a world without satellite or cable television? Remember UHF? You know, you had the basic broadcast stations before satellite or cable TV, and then you had that UHF. How about a world without fax machines? Does anybody remember a world without microwave ovens? And now, testing your age, how about a world without handheld calculators? I remember a world without handheld calculators. So when you think about all these technological devices and changes that have occurred in the world, they're very, very dramatic. Not only are they dramatic, but they really are having an impact on everybody socially, behaviorally, attitudinally, and with values. It's a very different world that your kids are growing up in. And what's happening is parents are parenting differently. In 1968, parents had to keep tabs on their kids around town or in the neighborhood. In 2012, kids can go anywhere in the world without leaving their bedrooms. When you were 15 or 14 or even a child, how many of you could call your friends while walking down the street or riding in a car when you were teenagers? How many of you could cook a pizza in a minute and a half? Or conduct extensive research for a history paper without even going to the library? Could you get free music and free movies without even going to a store? Or even get free music or movies? How many of you, when you were a child, were able to turn the TV on and watch your favorite cartoon at 3 o'clock in the morning, or whenever you wanted? Well, these kids can with the 24-hour Cartoon Network. What's happening is kids have access to the world. They push a button and they get what they want. And not only do they get what they want, they often get it immediately. It's becoming a world of immediacy. So just take a step now and look at what affects a child's personality. You know, basically, very simplistically, it's a child's biology or their wiring that they really enter the world, as well as their environment that's shaping their personality. Well, we're not going to be talking about biology at all today, just environmental factors. A generation ago, children were influenced by their environment, including parents, extended family members, other adults. They were influenced by their peers, and to some extent, they were influenced by media, relatively tame media, as you'll see later. A generation ago, the peer influence was only limited to the telephone, which was a landline. When I was 15 and I received a phone call from my friends, it came into the home on a landline, in a phone that was in a public area. My parents knew who was calling. They were in earshot of the telephone conversation. It really wasn't private. A generation ago, peer influence is limited to the neighborhood kids. And it was limited to your exposure to peers in school as well. So today's unique challenge for educators and parents is, and I ask you, how are you going to accomplish your goal of raising happy and well-adjusted kids when technology has really magnified the influence on the psychological development of Generation Text? And I'll demonstrate how. What's happening is, because your kids have access to the world, there's a massive bombardment of messages from their peers 24/7. That's very different from the world you grew up in. Through cell phone calling, cell phone texting, instant messaging, emailing, social networking. These kids have a massive bombardment of messages from internet sites, access from their PCs, their laptops, and their mobile smartphones. There's a massive bombardment of messages that your children are receiving from media, from the 724 digitally generated TV satellite stations, broadcast and satellite radio transmissions, magazines, ads, and articles, and even billboards. I want to spend a moment just talking about media and marketing. What's happening is your kids are very, very sophisticated kids, and they're very, very sophisticated consumers. Billions and billions of dollars are spent in industry marketing to children and adolescents. And what's happening is they've become sophisticated, so they're the type of consumer that kids don't walk into a Starbucks and say, I would like to have a coffee. What they do is they say, I want a grande, decaf soy, macchiato, extra syrup, extra hot, whipped cream, chocolate sprinkles. They know what they want. They're sophisticated consumers. And they're not shy about asking for what they want. This is a magazine article. It appeared in People magazine. And as you can see, it's advertising. It's a full-page advertisement for promoting the show Gossip Girl, very popular show. I would say 12 years old and up usually watch this show. A lot of females, but males too. And, you know, they're advertising that's first new episode starts September 1st. And on top, the promoters say it's, in quotes, mind-blowingly inappropriate. So they're trying to get you and your kids to watch the show because it's mind-blowingly inappropriate. Well, guess who they're quoting? They're quoting the Parents Television Council, who was a watchdog group to help parents decide what's appropriate for their kids to be watching or not watching it. So how can they use that as sort of a warning from the Parent Television Council, but they're using it to promote the show? Why? Because kids today are attracted to the glamour, the edgy stuff, the risque, the risky. The Lindsay Lohans was who was arrested yesterday again. The athletes that are performing off the field in a way that's not appropriate. They're attracted to it, and advertisers know it, and they prey on our kids, knowing that they're attracted to it. How about this? More about the media. I'm picking on Calvin Klein, but Calvin Klein is, I'm just using their ads as an example. It's really across the board with many, many, many other companies. I was in the Chicago area presenting this presentation, and there happened to be the Calvin Klein executive in the audience, and he sort of took issue with me, so I have to use that caveat. It's not just Calvin Klein. But this advertisement, very famous model now actor, you can see the sexuality that's being presented in an advertisement like this, that kids are exposed to. This is a 16, almost 17-year-old model in a provocative pose. How about this? This is actually, or was, a billboard that was on a highway just outside of Houston, Texas. How about this? This was a billboard about a year ago, not this past summer, but the summer before, in Manhattan, in New York City. So you're driving in your car, and your 9-year-old or your 11-year-old or your 12-year-old, for that matter, sitting in the back seat, and they look up at this billboard and they say, "Mommy, Daddy, what's this?" And this is what you have to explain to them. My question is, just think about this. Remember, you have to think about this. All this stuff, media, technology, it's so embedded in our culture, we're not thinking about it, but yet we're exposed to it and we're being affected by it. It's sort of like driving to your office or driving to the supermarket or bank. You get there somehow, but you don't know how. You just know how you got there. That's what's happening in our culture. When did this become okay? It's not okay. So this is what I see happening and what worries me. I see that technology and the culture that our kids are exposed to are having dominant effects on our kids in terms of their personality, their values, their attitudes. And I see that parents' influence is being minimized. And if you're a parent out there, you know what I'm talking about. There's a sense that, as I talk to parents in my office and in my presentations, there's a sense that you're losing control over your kids in terms of imparting your own values and your own standards of behavior and how to treat people with your kids because of the access they have through technology to the world, as well as the culture, how it's impacting them. You're fighting it. This is really what we need to really attain. The parents should really be the major or dominant influence on our kids. Technology, of course, and culture have very positive places in our kids' lives. They're not all bad. This is going to, come across as negative to a large degree, but there are tremendous benefits to the culture and technology. I just want you to learn how to navigate through it so you can help your kids be influenced in a positive way. So the cultural impact is through the technological access to the world. There's also an excess of material possessions and privileges that kids have today compared to other generations. Parenting styles have changed, and I'll elaborate on that later. We live in a very competitive society and a very complex society. It's an age of specialization. That's the age your kids are growing up in, an age of options. And I want to give you sort of a silly example of that. When I was a kid, we wanted to buy orange juice. It came in 2 containers, a glass container or it came in a frozen can. Today, you can get orange juice in glass containers, plastic containers, cartons, frozen juice boxes, and pouches. Not only that, I made a trip to my local supermarket, and I made a list of all the varieties of orange juice that you can buy and came up with 30 of them. So now, it's a silly example, but this is what our kids are faced with today. There are so many options, so many decisions to make, and I think that's great for our kids to have options and to have decisions. I work with that and promote that in my office with my patients. Having options is a good thing. More chance that you'll be happy if you're choosing as opposed to being dictated to. The problem is we need to equip our kids with better decision-making skills to navigate through all these options. And I'm talking about social options as well as intellectual options. So you're all familiar with the generation gap, of course. I don't think I have to explain what that is. But this generation is different, and the gap is different. This generation is the first generation that really knows more than their parents because they're so adept at the technology. And what's happening culturally is so different than the one that you grew up in that I refer to it as a generation crater. That's how broad it is. So it's a markedly and a remarkably different world that your kids are growing up in. It's a world where technology is embedded in the culture and the technology changes rapidly. And these kids, they simply adapt to the new technology. They usurp its power effortlessly while leaving their parents in the dust. How many times do I walk out to my waiting room and I see a 9-year-old programming his mother's new telephone? The world is so different that the generation gap has turned into this crater, and what's happening is that kids are using that power and parents aren't even aware of it and how they're using it. So I want to talk about an ex-patient of mine whose name is Justin, but that's not his real name, of course. And this is a very powerful story that I want to tell you because it really gave me the impetus to write this book because it crystallized my feelings about what was happening in my office, which really is a cross-section in what's happening in our society. So Justin's a 12-year-old boy, and his parents are out to dinner on a Thursday night, and with entertaining important clients. They're both attorneys. And so at about 10 o'clock at night, Justin calls his mother. His older brother is 14 or 15 and staying with him. That's okay. He calls his mother up and he says, "Mom, give me your Amex card. I want to get a new lacrosse stick online." So I asked his mother, what did she's telling me this story. What did you say to him? Well, I told him I just bought him a new lacrosse stick 3 weeks ago. So Justin says to his mother, "This is a better one." So she said to me she couldn't argue. She had those clients there. It was embarrassing. So she said, "Okay, but this is the last time." And so she gave me the Amex card. So I thought about this story, and I thought about how powerful it was and how much was really, how rich it was in information about what's going on. First of all, he has immediate access to his mother. We didn't have immediate access to our parents, but through the cell phone, he has immediate access to his mother. Here he is shopping on a school night, 9 or 10 o'clock at night. We couldn't shop on a school night, 9 or 10 o'clock at night. The parents are also pursuing their careers, part of our culture too. He demands the credit card. How many of you demanded a credit card when you were a child? How many of you even thought that your parents even had a credit card, maybe didn't even have one? He doesn't ask for it, he demands it. And then, I mentioned the parents pursuing their career, and then of course, they indulge him. Here's the other thing. I just bought you a new lacrosse stick 3 weeks ago. He wants a better one. This is a better one. That's a direct result of technology and companies really marketing towards kids. The technology changes every 6 months, and kids, they have to have the newer one, the better one, the more powerful one, the more features. They're being brainwashed into getting newer and better very, very frequently. So it's a Generation Text child, but it's an access and excess child. They have access to the world with layers of unbridled privacy from their parents, and they have excess in their world. So should we be worried about Generation Text? Well, I think yes, because what I see happening is, and I think if you work with kids and if you're parenting a child, you're going to agree with me, their attitudes have changed negatively. Their values have changed. Their behavior has deteriorated. Overall, their work ethic is not a great work ethic. Their social skills and their social relationships and how they treat people has deteriorated. There's been an erosion for respect for authority. I have 17-year-olds who have their driver's license come into my office and say, "Oh, Dr. Osit, I got a speeding ticket today." And they go on to convey a whole conversation that they have, a very angry conversation and defense of that conversation with the police officer. And so I'll say something like, "Oh, so you thought to say that?" And they would say, "Oh, no, I told the officer that." 7-year-olds are talking back to principals. There's been an erosion for respect for authority. And then there's two other things occurring that I call social acceleration and acquisition acceleration. What I mean by social acceleration is sort of a modeling down. Kids are getting more and more privileges at younger and younger ages, such as 8th grade dances. Parents are hiring limousines to take them to the 8th grade dance. That was a privilege reserved for the senior prom in previous generations. How about drinking provided for 17-year-olds by parents? The thought there is that, I know he's going to drink anyway, so I might as well have them at my house. I take their keys. It's safer and more controlled. Well, it's inappropriate. Brazilian hair treatments for 10 or 11 or 12-year-olds, a process that costs up to $350 or $400. Spa birthday parties at 7-year-olds, for 7-year-olds, that include facials, manicures, pedicures, yoga classes. These are all privileges that really are afforded to older people. And what's the problem with that? Well, many of them are not mature enough. Two problems. One is they're not mature enough, responsible enough to handle those privileges. And the second is, if they're getting spa birthday parties at 7 years old, what are they going to want at 10 years old, 15 years old, 19 years old? In terms of acquisition acceleration, well, that just means that they're just getting things at younger and younger ages. They're getting smartphones now at 11 and 12 years old. They're getting designer pocketbooks at 10 years old. LeBron James, the famous basketball player, just came out with a $315 sneaker, a $315 sneaker, and children will get that sneaker. So they're acquiring things, expensive things, and things that give them a lot of power at younger and younger ages. That leads me into just talking about what's happening with parenting today. What I see happening in our society, and I'm going to be getting into the technological aspect and also sort of the how-to part, so just be patient with me. I see we have now created a child-centered culture with child-centered families. And what I mean by that is that I think there's an inordinate amount of time, money, emotions, activities, chauffeuring, attention, everything that's going into our children. And the problem with that is that the kids are feeling more empowered. Now, believe me, kids need to feel loved, they need to feel special, they need to feel important, they need privileges, they should get privileges. I just think we've gone overboard with all of those sort of indulgences. And when the kids, what's happening is that feeling of empowerment they have is giving them a sense of entitlement. And that's creating some of the behavior issues and the inability to accept no when you do say no. Along those lines, I see a lot of parenting as yes parenting. Kids are pushing more than ever with what I call tunnel vision syndrome. Can I have a cookie? No, we're going to have dinner in 5 minutes. And then they push. They don't accept it. They push and they push and they push. And they challenge and they negotiate. They just don't accept no. Almost every day in my office, sometimes several days in my office, this issue of kids not accepting no comes up. The competitive cultural climate. Parents want to say yes to their kids to give them every competitive edge. 8th grade SAT tutoring. And then there's parenting by guilt. I see a lot of that happening in our parenting society. Parents say yes because they feel guilty. So their parenting decisions are based on the feeling of guilt. Why? Well, we still have a 50% divorce rate. Oh, he lives in a divorced family. I have to say yes. I feel badly for him. We live in a society where 2-parent families are working and sometimes 2 and 3 jobs at a time. So they feel guilty. So they say yes. There's excessive work schedules. There's no 9 to 5 anymore. There's overnight travel. So you're away in Singapore on business for 7 days. You come home and your daughter asks you for something, you can't say no. So you say yes because you feel guilty about not being there, even when it's not appropriate to say yes. So what's happening is kids have this I want it now, this immediate gratification that not only do they can't be patient and wait for it, but because remember the technology is training their brains to push a button and get what they want. Well, parents are training their brains also in many ways too to get what they want. So here's the first thing. We have to start shaping what I call the gratification muscle in kids. We have to get them to be patient and accept the word no. And I use the analogy of a muscle because, and let's go with that analogy for a minute. If you're out of shape and you want to start getting in shape and you're going to start working out and you go to the gym, if you go to the gym one time and work out for an hour, you're not in shape and you're not toned. It just doesn't work that way. It's persistent and consistent and it's gradual. So if you have kids that you're working with or that you're parenting now that have this problem of not accepting no and pushing and pushing and pushing, then you do need to work on it. But please know that you need to work on it gradually with consistency. And just as in shaping your muscles, no pain, no gain. They're not just going to bow down and say, okay, sure, Mom, sure, Dad. They're going to put up a fight, especially when you start saying no. So it has to be shaped gradually, but you must be consistent. Once you have it maintained, just like you maintain your muscle tone, then it's easier to maintain. Then there's less pain. Here's something else what we need to be doing in our families. We need to have more balance in our families. And what I mean by that is that we need to have, in terms of time and balance, we need to have time spent as a couple, time spent with your friends, time spent with the kids' friends. You have to attend to your work, you have to attend to yourself, each child individually, and then you need time as a family. If any of you are old enough to remember the Ed Sullivan Show, he would have a plate spinner on his show. Basically, this was a man, usually, always a man I saw, and he held this pole with 7 or 8 tines on it, and he would spin a plate on the first time, and centrifugal force would keep the plate spinning. And then he'd take another plate, spin it on the second time. Before you know it, he has 7 or 8 plates spinning. That's sort of what you have to do in your life. Now, when one plate starts to wiggle, he needed to attend to it and spin it some more. And that's what you need to do in your life. When there's less time spent as a couple, you need to attend to that. Less time spent with each or one of your children, you need to attend to that. Because other things can be demanding in your life, taking away and making it imbalanced, but you always have to be aware of it and start attending to the plate that's wobbling in your life. Now I want to talk about work ethic with kids today. Well-adjusted kids, and that's what we're looking for, have well-adjusted kids. They have a good work ethic. They have a sense of industry, they're ambitious, they work up to the potential. What I see happening today is that, and of course I'm speaking generally, and it's kind of negative, but unfortunately it's what I see, and I think many of you see that also. Kids today have a sense of entitlement. They're not working for what they want things just because they're me. Well, think about it. The new latest and greatest video game is coming out for Xbox 360. It's coming out November 1st, so parents put a $5 deposit at their local GameStop, and November 1st comes and they go get the $70 game and they just have it. Why not make them work for that game? Otherwise they're getting this sense of entitlement. I should just get it. I should just get it. Kids have an attitude where it's good enough. Any of you that have helped your child with, say, a homework assignment, and they write a paragraph and you say, you know what, this is kind of simplistic. You're in 7th grade now. You need to write with a little more depth. Oh, Dad, it's good enough. Oh, Mom, it's good enough. That's what you'll hear. They also have low stamina. I had one in here in my office this morning, a 16-year-old who, he worked 4 hours the day before at the A&P, and he was exhausted. He worked 4 hours. They don't take initiative. They need to be told to do things. They are not self-starters, generally speaking. They don't go the extra mile. This is what I see happening in terms of their work ethic. So we have to work on developing our kids' work ethic. We have to help them understand that there are things you got to do and things you want to do. We have to give them perspective and humility. Many kids are very privileged, or no matter what your status economically is, you always have more than somebody else, and that should not be taken for granted. I think that what you should do is make sure that your kids are doing community service and have them experience it firsthand. Don't just say to them, holiday time, well, you know, let's gather some of your old toys and donate it to underprivileged children. Have them bring it to your synagogue or your church. Have them bring it to any organization that accepts toys so that they experience the giving firsthand. Of course, donate old unused stuff. Don't accumulate that stuff. Don't just toss it. You also have to help them organize their time. That helps develop a work ethic. With all these activities that kids are involved in, they're overscheduling. It's hard for them to be organized and structured. They need your help doing that. So what you have to do is you have to set goals for kids. Have them set goals and work for their things. When they work for it, then they earn it. They enjoy it more. They learn the value of money. They learn the value of possessions and having them, and not the sense of, oh, if it breaks, I'll just get a new one. Kind of a funny story, when my kids were young, very, very young, I said to them, whenever, to help them promote savings and the value of money, a sense of money and what it's good for and how to manage it, I said to them, every time you get money for birthdays, holiday money, or if you earn it babysitting or shoveling snow, or whatever you make, you could choose to put a certain amount in the bank, and then the rest you could spend on your own. But whatever you put in the bank, I will match it. So if you get $50 from Aunt Rose for your birthday and $40 goes in the bank, you're really putting $80 in the bank. And so that really gave them an incentive to save. Funny part of that story is when my oldest son was 12 years old, he comes to me and he says, Dad, how much money do I have in that account? And I told him he had a lot of money. He was doing really wonderfully. So he says, I want to take it all out. And I said, take it all out? What could you possibly want to buy at 12 years old for that much money? He had a lot of money in there. No, Dad, I don't want to take it out and spend it on anything. I just want to take it out and put it back in so you'll double it. I told him it doesn't work that way. Here are some of the things you need to do to develop work ethic. First of all, it has to be integrated into your whole family environment. They're not just going to learn it. You have to teach it. You have to model it. You have to identify work time versus play time. Use play time as rewards after work time is done. Set goals. You also have to model a positive work ethic as well. You have to model everything for your kids because kids really do emulate you as a model. You're a very powerful model, and you need to model the kinds of values and attitudes and social interactions that you want your kids to copy. There's one, respect rules of society. How many parents take their 15-year-olds or 14-year-olds into a R-rated movie when clearly the policy is 17 years or older, or else accompanied by an adult? So they buy the ticket, they go in with their 14-year-old and their friends, they sit down, they say goodbye, and they say, I'll pick you up when the movie's done. Call me on your cell phone. That's not respecting a rule of society. It's not good modeling. So you can't keep your kids in a bubble. They're going to be interacting through the internet. They're going to be interacting with other kids through their cell phones. And they're going to be watching TV and movie and commercials. So you can't really insulate them, and nor should you insulate them. They're going to have accidental encounters on the internet. They're going to have accidental encounters in the media, driving in the car, looking at that billboard. And they're going to see things in real-life situations. In fact, a study was done that indicated that 15 to 17-year-olds, 70% of them accidentally encounter pornographic sites on the internet. Accidentally. And that's happened to everybody. You know, you do a search, and there's a word a piece of a word. Here's an example. I had a 12-year-old doing a science paper, and he told me that he searched for the word nuke. He was doing it on nuclear reactors. So he searched the word nuke, and a bunch of nude pictures came up. And so they'll accidentally encounter them. The trick here is to use these as teachable moments, to be very, very present in your kids' lives, And not just to assume that they're going to get the right message from it, but talk about the message that's being sent. Sometimes it's a very subtle message. TV commercials, even on Nickelodeon, the TV commercials send very subtle messages about boys and girls and physical attractiveness, and you need to be talking about those. Here's a good example. Many of you have seen the movie Juno, a movie that's rated PG-13, and I play a clip of this in my presentation, my live presentation. The opening scene is a scene with two 16-year-olds having sex for the first time, and it's very graphic. There's no bones, no questions about it. They're having sex. The very next scene, the girl goes to a pharmacy, and she, in the bathroom, takes a home pregnancy test and finds out that she's pregnant. And then she's walking home, and she sort of mimics hanging herself, committing suicide as a way of dealing with that. Many of you have watched this movie. Many of you have watched it with your kids. Many of your kids have seen this movie. Very popular movie. You have to talk about these things with them. This is what I call a teachable moment. Don't be afraid to say to them, what do you think about her sort of thinking about dealing with that problem by killing herself? Did you know, ask them, did you know that you can get pregnant after having sex only one time? Kids have a very sophisticated sense of knowledge of sex these days because of the internet largely, but at the same time, there's a gap in their knowledge. And as sophisticated as they are, and they know a lot, believe me, they tell me a lot, there's some fundamental and basic things about sex or facts about sex that they don't know, that they need for you to fill in so that they have not misinformation but good information. So whenever you're exposed to something or they're exposed to something, use it as a teachable moment. Use it as an opportunity to impart your values, guide them with appropriate attitudes, values, and how to treat people. Speaking of how to treat people, let's move on to social relationships. Social skills are not, kids are not born knowing how to socialize. They learn it through observation, they learn it through direct teaching by adults, and they learn it through practice and interacting with their environment. Kids in the digital age have a heightened awareness of their social world. Technology makes it very easy for them to access their social world. And a lot of it is through written communication. Read this sentence. It says, a woman without her man is nothing. So this sentence says, women are nothing without men. Now, for all you women out there that are about to get upset with me, I want you to read this sentence. This sentence says, a woman without her man is nothing. So this sentence says, men are nothing without women. All I did was move the comma, and it changed the entire meaning of the sentence. So now, think about your kids. They're texting, they're posting on Facebook, they're sending inbox messages through social media, they're instant messaging. There's a lot of socializing going on with the written word. Are they attending to punctuation? They hardly even write out words. It's a whole new language. And so what's happening is a lot of miscommunications are occurring. Here's a perfect example. Just the other day, this is an 18-year-old college student who is depressed, and he has good days and he has bad days. And he has a woman he's just starting to see, maybe 3 months now. I don't know if you can call her his girlfriend or not, but so she texts him and says, I can't take your bad days anymore. And so he told me that. And I asked him, how do you feel about that text? And he said, well, you know, she's feeling for me. It's hard for her to handle them. And I said, possibly. She may also be saying to you that she's impatient and intolerant, that she doesn't want to stand for you having bad days anymore. So it's affecting relationships, sometimes, you know, in a negative way. What you have to do with your kids is they need coaching. They need coaching about the internet, and they need coaching about texting. I want to make a statement. I meant to make the statement earlier. Technology, cell phones, the internet, computers, by the way, they're not rights of kids. It is not a kid's right to have a cell phone, no matter what their age. It is a privilege for them to have it, and it should be treated as a privilege. Now, because they're so embedded in our culture, become such a normalized part of what kids do, parents are, I find, assuming that kids know how to use it. but they often don't know how to use it. So you have to treat it as a privilege, just as you would treat driving as a privilege. When my kids got their driver's license, they weren't allowed on major highways for the first 3 months, even though the law said they could. It was a privilege, but I had to impose some limits and some boundaries on that privilege until I was confident that they were responsible and mature enough to handle that privilege. Well, guess what? Cell phones are the same way. The internet is the same way. They're not rights, they're privileges. You have to teach them what is okay and what is not. This is the only world they know, the world they're growing up in. They don't realize that posting a certain picture is inappropriate, or saying certain things is inappropriate. So here's some examples of certain things you might say to them or ask them, is this appropriate or not appropriate? I'm going to elaborate more on what you need to be doing with the internet as well in a few minutes. So what's happening is I find parents are walking this tightrope, balancing between what their kids want and actually what they need. And parents are confused. They don't really know what to say yes to, what not to say yes to, because it's such a different world. And what happens is certain behaviors and certain possessions become familiar and normal. And they don't just stop there. Then they become, the next step becomes more familiar and normal. So drinking in college has now become drinking at 17. Getting cell phones when they get their driver's license at 17 has now become 9 years old when they're getting cell phones. But sometimes, you have to say, this is the culture. You can't marginalize your child socially. This is the way they're relating to one another. They're relating to one another through Facebook and through their cell phones. If they don't have them, then they're going to be isolated and out of the loop. So you have to sort of balance everything. So here's what you have to do. You have to do some reality checks in terms of what kind of parent you're being. So you have to say to yourself, or to your partner, if you're lucky enough to be parenting with a partner, do you think I'm being too strict with the kids? Am I being too easy on them, too controlling, overly involved, not involved enough? What am I not doing enough of with the kids? Remember, your presence has to be very, very important and dominant in your kids' lives. So how do you know what's normal for kids today and what's okay for kids to be getting and doing? How do you deny your kids things that you know their friends are doing and getting without making them a social outcast? These are questions I get asked all the time. If all of those 14-year-olds are going to that R-rated movie and it's contradictory to your values and morals for your 14-year-old to watch a movie with nudity in it, then what do you do if all of her friends are going? How do you decide what's appropriate and what's not appropriate? Well, here is the criteria that I don't want you to use. Everyone has it. That's not a criteria to say, okay, you can have it. Everyone is going. It's not a criteria to allow your child to do things that may be risky or they're not ready for. Here's the criteria. Is it safe? What they're asking for, does it contradict our family's fundamental morals or values? Is it something that's financially extravagant? Does it socially accelerate my child? Is he or she not ready for that? And then you have to look at the big picture in making decisions for your kids in terms of what they're ready for. These are some of the questions, or all of the questions you should be asking. And if a lot of them end up being yes, then it's probably okay to let your child engage in that activity or buy them whatever they're asking to be, whatever digital device they want or electronic device they want. But not always. The drinking thing at 17, you can answer yes to all these, but still not appropriate. So here's how you make technology work for you. Because you can't keep technology from kids. It has tremendous benefits for them. You want to make it available to them. But you want to make it available to them like any other privilege. You want to make it controlled. You want to place computers in common areas. You want to teach them the appropriate use of the computer. You want to observe and listen. I do recommend that parents, when they allow their kids to have a Facebook account, to have the contingency, I must have your password and I must be friends with you. You never have to post on their wall. You never have to interact with them, but you want to know what they're posting and what's being posted and what they're exposed to. And you have to get their password. You can't, it's not good enough to be friends with them because they have ways of blocking certain messages. And you need to check. I also promote, when you give your child a cell phone, even if they have one right now, as much as they're going to complain, what you need to do is say to them, I will periodically be checking your text messages and your phone calls in terms of whom you're calling. And, you know, a lot of parents have a problem with this in terms of trust. That communicates to my child that I don't trust my child. Well, you know what? It's a dangerous world out there. Really, really good kids are getting into lots of problems, lots of trouble, legal problems even. And what I find is happening is parents tend to do damage control. It's too late when that naked picture was sexted to some guy in another high school. It's just too late. It's there already. Then you have to do damage control. And, you know, some of you may say, well, you know, kids are sophisticated. They delete histories on the computer. They delete their text messages. They delete their pictures. Well, guess what? Remember I said their work ethic is poor? They're not that diligent. If you check intermittently, you will see things on there that will give you red flags about what your kids are either about to engage in that's dangerous or unhealthy or are already engaging. You want to master the technology. Do not be intimidated by the technology. You can have your kids teach you the new device or the power of it or all the features that the new cell phone that you're giving them does. But you need to understand that power that you're putting in their hand. You have to keep pace with the technology and then have them capitalize on the full power of it. The technology can also be used to compensate for weaknesses. There are a lot of parents out there that have children who have disabilities that are listening. Well, the technology is a wonderful device, either the internet, PowerPoint presentations, cell phone. How about social anxiety and the use of texting or the use of Facebook to engage in social interactions? Not as a sole interaction, social interaction, but as an initial interaction and as one to maintain social interactions. So what you need to do is treat all these things as privileges, set limits, time of day limits that they can use them, set the amount of time that they can use them. You need to check them intermittently, and you also have to be insisting on face-to-face interactions. If your child or a teenager is relying too much on texting for their social interactions, from time to time you've got to tell them either call or face-to-face instead of texting. You have to do things like limit the use of the technology during family time, such as meal times. No cell phones during meal times, you included. Families need to plan screen-free days. No televisions, no Game Boy DSs, no handheld video games, no video games, no cell phones, no computers. Do things as a family and interact. What's happening is there's a tremendous amount of isolation within families these days. You know, teenagers isolate themselves anyway, and that's part of their normal individuating process of separating from the family. But technology has enabled them to do it beyond the limits. So here's some general recommendations that I have. You know, I get this sense from parents that they're losing, as I said earlier, losing control over their kids. And what I think you need to be doing is you need to be encouraging kids, and you as well, to engage in both old and new cultural offerings. You have to really integrate, to take back sort of control of what's going on with your kids. You need to integrate tried and true parenting strategies, basic fundamental parenting strategies like saying no and sticking to the no, setting appropriate limits that are safe for your kids, all those limits in good parenting, integrating with the present culture as well as the technology, because they can also be beneficial. So here's what I really term as the 10 rules of contemporary parenting. First, we need to emphasize the importance of family. We're losing that sense of family. You need to really be making sure that you're creating family activities, not everybody going off in different directions. Having family dinners whenever you can. I know schedules are tough, but you must insist on everyone participating in family dinners, not eating at different times or in their rooms. And, you know, if you're going to visit grandma and your 15-year-old says, oh, I don't feel like going, make her go. It's emphasizing the importance of family and those connections. To raise healthy kids in contemporary society, you have to have unconditional love and balance. Kids are exposed to so many things, they're going to present you with so many things. If you're creating a good communicative climate in your relationship with your child, then they're going to come to you with things that they see on the internet that may be very sensitive or uncomfortable for him or her and you. They may be thinking or feeling certain things that they're exposed to, and they may come to you. You have to communicate unconditional love and balance, unconditional love, so that you reserve judgment, allowing them to talk it through with you. The balance is the balance in the family life that I referred to earlier. 3, you need to be consciously defining your fundamental values. They have to be present, verbalized. They have to sort of be identified and crystallized for the kids so that they're not learning values through the bombardment of messages outside of your parenting. 4, you need to constantly evaluate normalcy. Because everything becomes so familiar and normal and then distorted almost in terms of age and what's normal for the age, you have to take a step back. That's one of the things I wanted you to do tonight. Take a step back and say, wait a second, is this okay? Is this not okay? You need to be an active parent, not a passive parent. Active parents check cell phones. Active parents monitor websites that your child is visiting on your computer. Active parents explain to their kids what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Passive parents are the ones doing the damage control when the police are at the door, or when their child creates a website that's a bullying website, an anti-David Smith website. Active parents are actively involved in their kids and being proactive. 6, be careful to model behavior that's consistent with your moral character and with your behaviors. Here is a perfect example. I had a 13-year-old boy spent a session with me, and he was talking about his playoff basketball game that he played in, and he was very sad because every time he looked up into the stands, he saw his mother talking on her cell phone and not paying attention to the game. So the session was over. We talked about it, and he expressed his feelings very, very well. Mom comes in, and she's holding her cell phone, and the 13-year-old boy is sitting in the seat, and he's not involved in the conversation. She was talking to me about the next appointment or whatever, some administrative thing, not a therapeutic issue. And he takes out his Game Boy DS and starts playing it. He had it in his jacket. He wasn't part of the conversation. And so she starts becoming very annoyed with him. And she says, "You're playing that Game Boy again." And she's pointing a cell phone at him in her hand. And then finally she yells at him and says, shaking her hand with the cell phone in it, "Put that darn thing away already." Now that's poor modeling. He just spent the time talking to me how she wasn't attending to his game, but she was on her cell phone all the time. It's inconsistent, it's hypocritical. Watch those subtle inconsistencies in your modeling. 7, you want to keep pace with technology, and you want to keep pace with the youth culture. I mentioned that Lindsay Lohan was arrested last night. You have to know that. You have to find out why, because they're talking about it at the lunch table. And you want to counter the glamour of what she did with how inappropriate it was or unhealthy it was. So you must keep pace with technology, and you must keep pace with the youth culture. Establish and maintain appropriate limits. You must parent your children. Kids have too much power these days. They really do. They're entitled to autonomy and independence, but it has to be balanced and appropriate. And the only way that's going to happen is if parents are setting those limits. Take a look at what you're allowing your child to do and not do in terms of the technology, as well as things like curfew, how they handle their homework. Do they have their cell phone on and with them when they're doing homework? There's no need for a cell phone when they're doing homework. They do have need for the computer at times, but no need for a cell phone. It should be parked somewhere else. 8, you want to work towards that healthy balance within yourself as well as your family and for your kids. Be careful not to be overscheduling your kids. Be careful that they're not spending too much time on the video game machine or on the internet. And lastly, you want to use the Generation Text culture to benefit your child. Look for the positive things that they are exposed to and highlight those. accentuate those so that you minimize the negative messages. This generation really has an opportunity to be poised to become the most well-informed, the most literate, and the most socially adjusted generation ever. They really can with what's out there, all the advantages with this tremendous information age. The ultimate goal then is really to transform Generation Text into Generation Best. I just have on this slide some recommended law enforcement groups that recommend these two websites. There are ways to monitor what your kids are doing on their cell phones from your computer, as well as there are monitoring programs that you can really attach to or install into your computers that you really know and can guide your kids, know when they're going into dangerous places and guide their kids. And you have to hang in there. It's really tough parenting today and working with kids. It's the perfect storm. They have a lot of power and they have access to the world, and they have it with that privacy that I talked about. And there's a lot of danger out there, but there's also a lot of good out there as well. And you have to help them identify which is which. So at this time I will entertain questions.
Wow, those were some, I love that example of the modeling with the shaking the cell phone. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to leap right into a couple that were just posted because I think that they're very intriguing questions. And one parent is asking, and this I think is kind of a classic question, how does it happen in a household with two children that one feels this sense of entitlement, never takes responsibility, while the other one is well-adjusted and responsible? I know it's individual, obviously, because these are, individual kids, but, that happens all the time, I think, in all kinds of ways. How the kids eat or behave doesn't seem to matter. They each act differently.
That really is an excellent question, and it does happen often. There are so many variables that go into a child's behavior. The wiring is one. Part of the answer is that your children, each one of your children, even though they come from the same two parents, their brains are wired a little bit differently. And they have certain propensities towards being aggressive, or temperaments towards being aggressive, or being passive, or athletic, or intellectual. But the environment also comes into play. And it's a myth to believe that you can parent your children exactly the same. They're not going to really come out the same. There are certain standards as parents you have to maintain in a family, such as certain rules and standards like no hitting, for example. But I ask you this. If you have two children, and let's say one is 9 and one is 7, or one is 14 and one is 10, the 14-year-old does not have the same family experience as the 10-year-old. Just think about that. The first 4 years of her life, she was an only child. How many years did the 10-year-old have as an only child? The answer is never. That is a factor that will create different behaviors in a child. So they can't, also their ages sometimes and what's happening sometimes in the family creates differences in behavior and attitudes in kids. For example, maybe there's marital stress a certain year or two that the younger one reacts to. And the other one, their personality is much more well established at that point, so they won't react as much because they didn't have that marital strife when they were 9 years old. So there are so many factors that go into environmental factors that go into creating different behaviors in kids. But I think in the end, you have to stick to your basic values and basic code of behavior and rules for all of your kids.
Well, yes, but then those are all adjusted, obviously, based on the age of the kids. So at a certain point, they're more equal, probably, because the kids may be similar in age, but then all of a sudden you get a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. They have very different privileges and abilities to do things.
Well, yeah, the technology also, think about that. The 16-year-old may have gotten his first cell phone at 14, and the 12-year-old may have gotten it at 10 years of age. Yeah. I'm telling you, the standards change every couple of years. So each child is not having the same worldly experience.
Wow. All right. talk a little bit about family constitution, family meetings, things like that, that would help, would those kinds of things help to achieve these 10 rules that you were talking about?
I actually promote family meetings in my book, Generation Text. I think it should be done on a regular basis. Even if your family is not having any difficulties, it's just a great way to connect and review. It's almost like having a regular business meeting with your partners and your employees. It's like a staff meeting. And family meetings should occur once a week or once every other week, at very least once a month. And all children participate in the meeting. And what I promote is that during the week or in the interval between meetings, you have something hanging in a common area of the home, refrigerator or whatever, and anyone can post an issue they'd like brought up at the family meeting on that.
Okay,
and that becomes the agenda. It becomes the agenda. And it makes kids feel like they're invested in running of the family and invested in having a happy family and one that runs smoothly. So, for example, if your 10-year-old thinks that he has too many responsibilities in terms of chores, he might write the word chores down on the agenda list. And then the parents run the meeting, and it's somewhat democratic. The kids don't get to decide. You talk about it as a family, but sometimes you may listen to your kids and agree with what they're asking for because it's reasonable and it's respectful. That's the other thing. It promotes respectful interaction, not demanding and disrespectful tones of voices.
And it's all out in the open, so everybody's hearing it, so that the discussion is part of everyone's involved in it, and it's not like some secret deal being made with one kid.
Good point. Exactly.
Okay, I like that idea. So how do you handle the situation when parents have different philosophies regarding parenting and setting limits and all of that? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, that's a very common phenomenon. Each parent comes into the union, into the marriage, with their own training as a parent. What was their training? Their training was how they were parented and their childhood experiences. They could be very, very different. And what happens is when they're very different parenting approaches, you usually end up with a manipulative child, a not a well-behaved child, an angry child, and sometimes even a depressed child. Certainly a confused child, because each parent has a different set of rules. That's too confusing. And parents, if you're really experiencing, I actually deal with this in the book as well. If you're co-parenting with someone that has a different set of standards, expectations, sense of consequences or lack of consequences, you need to be talking and discussing with them to be on the same page more and more, because it's damaging to your children. And what happens, the child will manipulate play one parent off the other. They'll split the parents. They'll create a lot of marital issues that way, arguments. It's really not a healthy scenario for a family. So if you're identified as, parenting differently than your partner, you need to start talking and communicating and coming to some compromise or middle ground.
Would some outside help be useful in that kind of a situation?
It usually is. I mean, I really promote people really trying to work things through on their own. I think it's much more empowering for parents to try to, really work their parenting issues out without the help of a professional. I mean, it sounds like it's really bad for business, but I really think that's a very, very, very good thing to do. And if you really feel you can't get anywhere and you need a professional, then it's really a wonderful thing to consult with a mental health professional that is adept in parenting and family functioning.
Okay. Would you elaborate a little more on privacy issues? It seems to me that teens are afforded way more privacy than they are entitled to or old enough to be responsible with. And I don't know, it's like you raise your kid and you raise them up to a certain age, and then like you throw the switch and all of a sudden you don't get to ask the questions, or you don't get the kind of responses that you think you should have when you ask the questions. They seem to shut down in sharing. So talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a huge problem.
And that's really another excellent point and question. That's part of what I'm talking about in terms of kids having so much power. Why should they? have, they're entitled to some privacy, but if they're giving you grunts and one-word answers, that's just not appropriate. You need to know what's going on in their life to a large degree, maybe not 100%, but you do have a right as the parent to know what's going on. And kids, as I mentioned earlier, the technology is affording them the ability to have more and more privacy away from the parents. Think about that landline telephone call as opposed to a text that your 15-year-old is receiving. There's no way you can know what's being communicated and what's going on in their life. That's why you have to be involved. And to me, you have to take back the power. If they're refusing to talk about their friends, if they're refusing to let you know what's going on, because they're highly influenced by their friends, the expression guilty by association, it's really an unfair expression, but with teenagers and latency age kids, it's probably true. If your kids' friends are smoking marijuana, they're probably smoking marijuana. If they're drinking or cutting class, they're probably cutting class. So they are guilty by association. It's good to know what's happening with your kids' friends. You could talk to your kids' friends. They're willing to talk to you more than their own parents, in a friendly way, not in a prying way, but just have conversations with them. But here's what I'm getting at. That privilege of the cell phone, if they're not willing to share what's going on in their life, then they shouldn't have that cell phone. You take it away. Not forever. You take it away for a few days, or a day, or 3 days, or a week, and you give it back and say, when you're willing to be more communicative with me, if you're willing to be more communicative with me, then you can keep the phone. You can keep Facebook. You can keep the Internet. I had a man at the end of a talk, big, burly football player looking guy, come up to me and say, Dr. Osit, I have a 16-year-old, and I need for you to answer this question for me. And he went on to tell me how he's abusing his cell phone in terms of time and what he's doing on it with other girls. So I said to him, well, it's clear. He's abusing the privilege. You take it away from him. And this big 6'2", 220-pound guy looks at me and he says, Dr. Osit, I can't do that. I said, why not? He said, he'll get angry at me. This is the mentality. What do you mean he'll get angry at you? But he'll learn. He doesn't have the privilege unless he complies with what you think is appropriate. That's the general message. So this whole privacy thing, kids, they have to crystallize their own identities, and I have a great appreciation for that. I promote it in my office all the time with the kids I work with. But there are limits. There's limits to everything. That's the problem. Everything is going beyond those appropriate limits.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue because we've certainly gone beyond our time, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here. The questions that we didn't get to will get posted on the chat board. Dr. Osit, thank you very much. A lot of great information, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us on our webinar, Generation Text, Raising Well-Adjusted Kids in an Age of Instant Everything. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The discussion board is open and will be available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Osit, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending.